So today, I was sitting, discussing old weird experiences with my sister, and she reminded me of a house we used to live in Michigan, that Bled. It was a small single-story house that sat back off the gravel road in a cluster of trees. One afternoon, our aunt and cousins came over, and it was so nice out that we all sat out on the picnic table and on the lawn chairs outside. My mother had just made a large pitcher of iced tea, so she instructed me to go in and get the pitcher from the fridge and bring it out with some plastic glasses. I ran inside and grabbed the pitcher out of the fridge. I took it out and ran back to get the glasses. That's when I saw the drop of blood on the threshold of the kitchen door. It was a big drop, like about the size of a quarter and bright red. I thought to myself, great, I must have stepped on something and cut my foot. So I went into the bathroom and got a Kleenex and wiped the blood up off the floor. I then sat down and examined my feet. Nothing. No cuts, no blood, not even a scratch. I ran out to my mum with the glasses and said, "Someone must have cut their foot, because there was a spot of blood on the floor." My mum asked if I'd cleaned it up, and I said yes. My aunt then told all the kids to check their feet and make sure they weren't bleeding. All the kids did, and no one found any cuts. My mum then said, maybe it was a drop of tea I had spilt, and just thought it was blood. I argued that no, I wiped it up, and it was blood, and that I would even go and get the Kleenex out of the rubbish and show her. So, I went inside to get the Kleenex, and saw that there was another spot of blood on the floor, in the exact spot. I ran outside, and said, "Come look, there's another drop." My mother said, "But I thought you said you cleaned it up." I told her, I did, but there's another drop. Someone is bleeding and just doesn't want to say that they cut themselves. So my mother told me to go and clean the other drop of blood up and bring her the paper towel so she could examine it. Then she ordered all the kids to form a line so she could personally examine everyone's feet. I went inside and grabbed a paper towel and wiped up the drop of blood. But as I was wiping it, another drop fell and landed right on top of my hand. I jumped back, looked up, and saw that the blood was coming from the ceiling. I screamed and ran outside, bumping into my mother as she was running in to see what had happened. I held out my hand with the bloody paper towel and the splotch of blood on top of my hand. My mother grabbed my hand and said, "What did you do? How did you cut your hand?" I told her, "No, I didn't cut myself. The house is bleeding." My mum and my aunt by now, plus all the kids were staring at me. And my mother told me, "Don't be stupid. Houses don't bleed." I quickly pointed to the threshold, where by now a small puddle of blood had appeared, maybe about a teaspoon's worth. They all looked, and my mother said, "Oh my goodness, who cut themselves?" I pointed to the ceiling, and they all saw the fist-sized splotch of dark brownish red that had seeped through the ceiling and was now dripping blood onto the floor. My aunt made the sign of the cross upon herself. She was Catholic and did this as a means of protection. She said, "Oh my goodness," then ushered her kids out of the door and into the car. She then stood in the doorway of the house and told my mother that it's demonic and that she'd better get us kids and get out until a priest comes and blesses the house. My mother looked at her as if she was stupid and her with a wave of her hand. Then my mum said, "Give me a paper towel," and she proceeded to wipe up the blood on the floor. She then got a stepladder and wiped up the blood from the ceiling. We all watched to see if it was bleeding again, but nothing happened right away. A few minutes later, the puddle started forming on the ceiling and then dropped a bright red drop on the floor. My mum said that it had to be a dead squirrel that climbed into the attic and died. Being the smart kid that I was, I said, "But Mum, if it's dead, it wouldn't bleed fresh blood." She glared at me and gave me one of the "shut your mouth if you know what's good for you" glares and said, "Not if it just died. Go call your dad to come home and check the attic." My dad was down the street playing cards with the neighbours, so I called him and he acted frustrated, but he said okay and he would come home. A few minutes later, my dad pulled in and my mum explained what was happening. He had a funny look on his face and told me to get the hammer and flashlight for him, so I did. He proceeded to unnail the attic door, and I stood there watching him. I asked why the door was nailed shut to begin with. He explained that when we first moved in, the attic door wouldn't stay closed. Then my mean mum decided to intrude and told me to leave my dad alone and go sit in the living room with the rest of the kids. So pouting, I did. They got the door open and headed carefully up the stairs to the attic, which is just like a single large room with a small painted shut window. They got to the top of the steps when the door slammed shut on them and my dad's flashlight died, leaving them in the dark. My mum screamed and I heard my dad yell, and then the hammer banged on something. I ran over and pulled on the door to open it, but it refused to open, and I told my mum that it was locked. My dad kicked it open, splintering the old door in half, and they came rushing out, their faces drained of colour, and my mum scared half crazy. They boarded up the entire door with heavy plywood, nailed excessively. After that, it wasn't long before we packed up and moved. Years later, I heard the rest of the story. Apparently, the attic was spotless, not even dust, and then suddenly, my dad's flashlight beam aimed at about where the blood was coming from. The light beam fell on the figure of a dark hooded man kneeling on all fours. When the flashlight beam hit him, he lunged forward growling a demonic growl. That was when my dad yelled and threw the hammer at it. Then they ran down the stairs as the light went out. It wasn't until years later that my mother said that in the beginning, someone had told them the house was haunted, but the rent was so cheap and down the road from our friends that they overlooked it. They also said the door to the attic wouldn't stay closed, and that if they locked it with the hook lock, they'd walk back into the kitchen and find the door wide open, with a freezing cold air coming down the stairs. And so they took to putting a chair up against the doorknob to brace it shut. One night, after we'd all gone to bed, something knocked on the attic door and just kept pounding on it like it was an emergency. My mother took her crucifix that had been soaked in holy water and had my dad nail it to the door, and the pounding stopped. The door was the kind that had lattice rungs on it for ventilation, and my mum swore she saw a huge eye staring back at her through the slats once when she went to peek through the door. She also felt constantly like she was being watched from that door, which is why she had it nailed completely shut. But the house bleeding was the last straw, and so we moved. After we moved, my parents would drive by and the lights would be on in the attic, even though there was no electricity or wiring up there for lights. And one time, as we passed, we saw a man in black standing in the light looking out the attic window. We stopped driving by there after that, and the house stayed vacant for years. About 5 years ago, I went back to see if as an adult I could pick up on anything, and it looked the same as before, but people were living in it, and it looked like they had converted the attic into a bedroom because I could see a headboard and curtains. I knocked, but no one answered. Maybe it's just as well. Has anyone else been in a house or heard of a house that bled? I'd be curious to know if it's common, or if any of you can figure out why a house would bleed. Hello everyone, SinisterShaf here. This was day 2 of ShafTober. Today's story was The House That Bled by PookaShellTourGuide. Thank you for letting me narrate your story. If you enjoyed this video, then please remember to like and subscribe if you have not done so already. Also, share this video with your friends. You can now also follow me on Facebook and Twitter at SinisterShaf. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay sinister.